Hey y'all, Coaching the Fight here, talking about the last 3 days of the Feast of Tabernacles. Yep, I hope you guys have had a good tabernacling experience this week. We have been getting a lot of feedback as far as some spiritual events taking place in a lot of people's lives. I do recognize not everybody will take the time to leave a comment, so I'm sure there's a lot more going on than what we've actually seen by way of comments. So for you guys who are just coming into this experience, I want to congratulate you guys. But it's not quite over yet. We still have some important stuff to talk about, particularly the events of the 23rd day, which falls on the 11th of October, and the 21st or the 24th day, I should say. So we're going to talk about 3 different passages here discussing these end of tabernacling events. I do understand that it would have been a trying experience for a lot of people, especially dealing with these hurricanes and stuff going on. Some of you guys, including myself, was out there in a tent in all of the rain and stuff like that. But, you guys remember that we are in the 10 days of awe. We've covered this a lot of times on our channel. We're given 10 days to get this stuff right. Starting back there in 2017, we're actually given 10 years to learn how to do this right. And so think about all of the experiences that you had during your tabernacling experience, and then understand that there's coming a day when we will all have to sleep in a tent. This is kind of a dress rehearsal thing now, so we can work the bugs out, I believe. If your tent is leaking, if you need a new one, if you don't have one, or, stuff like that, we're given 10 years to actually work that stuff out, so that when we are towards the end of the apocalypse, and, we find ourselves having to live in a tent, we'll already have the confidence knowing that we can survive out there. All right. So the first verse that I want to talk about is over here in Second Chronicles and chapter 7. On second thought, let's jump over to the Gospel according to John and chapter 7, because we want to start off talking about the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And I'm not sure if I brought this out in my previous class I did on the 8th day. So let's just read here in chapter 7, verse 37. It says, "In the last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood and crying, saying, 'If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink.'" So this is the Messiah celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles, as we read over there in the book of John. I think it's important to understand that he did keep those feasts because he was our example of how to keep the law. But notice here is that it's on the great day, the last day, that they call Shemini Atzeret. And you see what he's saying there in verse 38. He says, "He that believeth on me, as the scripture has said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water." Rivers of living water. Now, I'm sure we could do a whole class on what these rivers of living water is, but I'm sure it has some type of spiritual meaning that we really need to understand. But the point that I'm bringing it out is that it is somehow related to this Feast of Tabernacles. I mean, we do understand that we are building the third temple. So, we look over in books like Ezekiel and how that third temple will have a river of water flowing out of it. Well, this, I believe, is what it's talking about here when, he's kind of making a connection between the 8th day and of the Feast of Tabernacles and that river of living water that'll be flowing out of the tabernacle. All right, so now let's jump over to Second Chronicles and verse 7. You see there in verse 9 is also talking about the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. Notice how it says there, for they kept the dedication of the altar 7 days and the feast for 7 days. And this is, has a lot to do with what's going on here is, this third temple, it has the same structure as the earthly temple. That's why I showed you guys that picture over there by Clarence Larkin, if I could get back to it, that was showing you the temple structure, because each one of those elements that you find in that earthly temple that was, or that tabernacle that was built out there in the desert or in the wilderness, each one of those elements you'll actually find in our temple, in our spiritual temple. You have a courtyard, you have the altar in the courtyard, and then you have the area that's more holy, which would be getting a little bit closer to our conscience. And then inside of there, inside of that tent in there, you would have the holier of holies, where the Ark of the Covenant would be. All of that stuff is in our spiritual temple. I did a class one time in a church environment where I explained this, how this entire tabernacle compound is actually built inside of our spiritual temple. But now let's look over at chapter 7, verse 10. It says, and on the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away into their tents, glad and merry of heart for the goodness that the Lord has showed unto David and to Solomon and to Israel his people. Okay, so the Shemini Atzeret, or the 8th day of the great festival, the tabernacles, will fall on the 22nd day of the month. But now we're looking at the 23rd day of the 7th month. And you see here that Solomon is actually sending the people away. So they're going away, going back to, where they live. Of course, they would have made that trek all the way to Jerusalem. And it was on the 23rd day that, everybody left. He gave them some gifts kind of thing. There would have been a big celebration as the people go back to their lives. And that's where we are kind of at now, where we have been building this temple, this tabernacle, for over a week now. And then we're kind of going to get back into doing normal kind of stuff. Some of us will go back into our houses, and back into that comfortable environment, and bivouac is over kind of thing. So it's a bigger deal for a lot of us, more so than the ones who didn't actually get to sleep in a tent. But we've all been involved in this tabernacle building period, whether we know it or not. But now, while we're over here, let's look at some of the other things that actually went on after Solomon had dedicated this temple. You see right here in verse 12 of chapter 7 that the Lord has made a second appearance to Solomon. You remember the first time he came down and he talked to Solomon. It was the time when Solomon told the Lord that he wanted wisdom instead of riches and fame, and the Father blessed him in that manner. Well, you see here, this is actually the second time that the Lord appeared unto Solomon, and it is right after the dedication of this tabernacle. Now, we have to remember that all of this stuff is a living parable for us. So after we have dedicated our spiritual temple, we can start to expect visitations from our Father. Now, is he going to come down in a material manifestation that we can actually see? Is there going to be a bunch of thundering and lightning and trumpets and stuff blowing as he appears to us like he did back there with Solomon? You don't think so. We don't think so, because you remember the era that we in now. We're in the era which involves baptism and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So our Father doesn't have to speak to us in audible tones anymore. He can speak to us through our intuition. He can speak to us through our conscious. He can speak to us through our dreams. Those are his communication pathways. So my point is that, as we go on day for day, and we kind of got our ears open for our Father to come and speak to us. We should be looking for him to talk to us in that manner. Like I said, intuition, dreams, and our conscious. And that conscious, guys, is that small, still voice that you will hear if you can ever get to a quiet place. It's actually trying to persuade us into righteousness. That's actually the voice of God speaking, directly to us. That's how he talks to us. And just so you know, dreams is the spiritual communication. He's talking to our spirits. That's a lot of times why we don't understand our dreams, is because he's really talking to our spirit man. He's not so much talking to us like he would with the conscious. And then you have intuition, which we did a whole class on intuition earlier this week. So you guys should jump over and check that class out as well. All right, notice what's going on there in verse 12. Let me go ahead and read it. He says, "And the Lord appeared to Solomon by night and said unto him, I have heard thy prayer and have chosen this place to myself for an house of sacrifice." Okay, so a couple of big points here is, one, he's appearing to Solomon at night. Now, is this a dream that he's talking to Solomon in? Very well could be. And then you notice how he says that he has chosen this house. So now back then it was a physical house, but now he's talking about our spiritual temple. I keep bringing this up because it's extremely important for us to understand that our bodies is his tabernacle. That's always been the plan, is that he will dwell inside of us and we would be like a temple for him. Let's go on. Let's look at verse 13 and 14. All right, now you looking at verse 13, you see how he's kind of answering that prayer that Solomon had did over in the previous, I believe it was the previous chapter. Let's look over there right quick. Yeah, it's actually in Second Chronicles chapter 6. We see Solomon's dedication prayer. That was a serious prayer. We did a class on this prayer because it's talking about how if we were to turn towards the temple and say our prayers, it kind of give them extra force, extra power, kind of, and, since we are prayer warriors, that's kind of important to us to understand, anything that will give our prayers extra boost. So we did a whole class on that. But you see, this over here is the answer to it. Over there where Solomon was saying, I pray thee, Father, that if your people will pray towards this tabernacle, will you answer their prayer, kind of thing. Well, you can see in chapter 7 how the prayer was answered. We can see, okay, did the Father say that? Did he say you have to turn towards the temple? Let's see. Verse 14 says, "If my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land." Okay, looking down through here, these are the only two verses that I've highlighted. Let's look at verse 15. "Now mine eyes shall be open and my ears attend unto the prayer that is made in this place," talking about the temple. So it's not really saying turn towards the temple that may be over there in the east, but I believe it's referring more to the temple that is on our conscience here. Look at verse 16. It says, "For now I have chosen and sanctified this house, that my name may be there forever, and mine eyes and mine heart shall be there perpetually." No, we need to go over and revisit that class that we did from Second Chronicles in chapter 6 and compare it to the answer that we got over here in Second Chronicles chapter 7, because our Father in his infinite wisdom is answering Solomon's temple dedication prayer with respect to the third temple, that spiritual temple. He's saying that, if we can pray in a humble manner, and seek his face through our prayers, then our prayers will be answered. So that's really interesting. We'll come back and we'll look at that some more. Like I said, we'll revisit that class that we did on praying to the east and give like an answer to that class. But let's jump over here and let's look at Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 1. We see that this is actually talking about the 24th day of the month. So you would have the 8th day celebration on the 22nd, which in 2020 that would have been on October the 10th, and then you would have had them going back home on the 23rd, which would be October the 11th, and then here this would be October the 12th, where we're talking about the 24th day of the 7th month. Now let me go ahead and read this. It says, "Now in the 24th day of this month, the children of Israel were assembled with fasting and sackcloth and earth upon them." Now you have to jump over to the end of chapter 8 to see that they are in fact talking about the Feast of Tabernacles. You see right there it says, "And they kept the feast for 7 days, and on the 8th day was a solemn assembly according to the manner." And then over here we're on the 24th day. Seems like it's kind of skipped a day, but I'm sure there's some way to reconcile all of that. But the main thing that we want to understand from this verse right here is number 2. It says, "And the seed of Israel separated themselves from all the strangers and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers." So here it is after the Feast of Tabernacles is over, where we would have been building the third temple. And you see now that feast is over, you see some separation being made. Like, these people have, built their temple, they've established their temple, and now they're starting to separate themselves from the strangers and, the other individuals. Like I talked about in one of my other classes, when you start to keep these feasts, when you start to keep these statutes, when you start to obey the commandments and the judgments, you actually are converted over to what we know as spiritual Israel. The word Israel is a spiritual name. It never was supposed to designate a race of people at all. That's why, that's why Jacob's name was changed to an angelic name by ending in EL, makes it an angelic name. And it's actually talking about a spiritual race of people. And just like Jacob did, you can go over and read that story in the book of Genesis, when he actually made a conscious decision to allow our Father, the Creator, to become his God, is when his name was changed to Israel. Well, the same way it is for us today. When we start to obey the statutes and allow our Father to become our God, then we too become Israel. That's a very important point that we understand, is that we actually become Israel. Well, you see here that, it is on the 24th day of the 7th month that there's a separation made between us who are now Israel and those who are still Gentiles. You read over in some parts of the New Testament. Let me jump over there and look, and we'll come back over here in a second. Looking over here in Matthew chapter 10, we just did a class on this entire chapter not too long ago. You guys check our channel. Our classes are what they call evergreen classes. At least about 80 to 90% of our classes are classes that, they don't wear out with time. You can go back and look at classes we did from 3-4 years ago, and they will still be just as, valuable today as they was back then, because they're scriptural based classes, and just like the scripture never changes, the value of those classes won't change as well. But you see over here, you see right there in verse 35, he says, I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against the mother, and the daughter-in-law against the mother-in-law. You see right there in 34, he says, think not that I'm come to send peace on the earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. So, that's what it's talking about over there in Nehemiah. You see right there in verse 37, he said, he that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. This is that separation that's talked about over there in Nehemiah. Now, sure, these are still our loved ones, and sure, we will always honor our parents and such. What it's primarily talking about is when those individuals try to drive you back towards a sin state. When now that we've cleaned up, now that we've got a clean slate, we can sometimes get around these people, and they want to do stuff like keep the pagan holidays, and they may have a problem with us when we don't want to celebrate those pagan holidays with them. Well, that's what this verse is talking about. If you love your mother more than me, meaning that if your mother wants to have a pagan holiday dinner and she invites you over there, and if you feel pressured and you go over there, breaking the first commandment and maybe even a few more commandments by participating in that pagan meal, if you do that for the sake of the love of your mother, then you're not worthy of him. And so we can mess up what we have created by letting our family members persuade us. Like, for instance, I don't want to name any. I'm trying not to name any of those holidays. I probably should, name them so you know what I'm talking about. These are holidays on the pagan wheel over there. Let me jump over there. I'm going to go ahead and name them. I'll spare you guys the picture here. I just went into Google and typed in pagan holidays, and you'll see that there are actually 8 holidays. I may not list them all here, but there are 8 pagan holidays. Just like you have holy days, the Father has 7 holy days around the year. By keeping those feast days, we actually receive the seal of God. Well, the opposite is true too. If you keep the pagan holidays, you kind of get that pagan seal. Well, you see some of these holidays, even though they're going by different names, you see here when you type in pagan holiday, you get the pagan names, but you can recognize some of these holidays here. That one that says winter solstice, that's actually Christmas. That one that says spring equinox, that's when we celebrate Easter. And then that one down there, it actually gives you the name, it's Halloween. Well, there for a lot of people who have now started building their third temple, their children are going to be a little bit upset when they try to tell them that you can't keep Halloween. We're not trick-or-treating this year. You can imagine those kids laying out. Some of them are going to throw tantrums. Some of those kids are really going to cut up. Well, what Matthew chapter 10 is talking about is that if you allow the love of your child to get you over there celebrating these other holidays, you're not really worthy of him. And the way I believe it works is it's going to undo what you've done. It's going to cancel out the efforts that you've done as far as keeping the holy days. I believe that's why they are strategically placed around the calendar. For instance, right after you finish Feast of Tabernacles, you have Halloween, and then of course there's the Feast of Hanukkah. We're going to be talking about that holiday coming up here next. After you finish Hanukkah, you have Christmas, and then after you finish the spring feast days, talking about Passover and unleavened bread, of course, you got the pagan holiday that comes right after that, and that's Easter. I believe they're strategically placed on the calendar in order to get us breaking the first commandment, which says that we will worship no other gods. Well, you see, though, you see me being careful not to mention, a lot of these names on here, because they are the names of pagan gods. That's what they're celebrating when, they perform the rituals associated with those holidays. They're actually doing it to worship their God. The same way with us, sleeping in a booth is a way of worshiping our God. Drinking wine on Passover, that's how we worship our God. Well, that trick-or-treat candy, those lights, or those Easter eggs, or those bunnies, or whatever, that's how they actually worship those gods. And so that's what Matthew chapter 10 is talking about when it says, if you love your son or daughter more than me, then you're not worthy of me. It's not really saying to avoid them altogether. Don't go visit mama no more. It's no. When mama start talking that, pagan stuff, it's like, mama, I don't participate in that stuff anymore. So that is what Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 2 is talking about when it says, and the seed of Israel separated themselves from all the strangers and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. So now this is important. The confession of the sins part is because, many of us have, celebrated these holidays, for years, and we have done other things to break the commandments that we read about over there in the law. And confession goes a long way. You think about your own children, and if you were to come home and the child comes up to you and says, mama, daddy, I have done a bad thing, I'd like to confess that I've done this bad thing. Well, you can imagine the punishment schedule won't be so severe as if you had to find out on your own, or even if the child went further and even lied about it and said that they didn't do it. If they confess that they did it, they might not have to, see the belt at all. It may just be a little bit of talking to. But, the opposite is true if they, are denying it or lying about it or whatever. So, we need to get in the art of confessing what it is that we've done wrong. Our Father, He knows it anyway. Just like a wise parent or whatever, he know who broke that thing, or he know who ate that cookie or whatever. He know you did it. Well, when we actually confess our sins, it'll go a long way to where we may not get punished for it so much. All right, now look right here. Verse 3 says, and they stood up in their place and read in the book of the law of the Lord of God 1/4 part of the day, and another 4th part they confessed and worshiped the Lord their God. Okay, so this is stressing how important it is to read and understand this law. After I finish this video, I'm going to go over and I'm going to turn on the book of Exodus. Let me show you over there what it's talking about, the book of the law. It starts in Exodus chapter 20 with the 10 commandments. You see the 10 commandments listed in Exodus chapter 20. And then when you go to chapter 21, you see verse 1 is talking about the judgments. And when you look in, the judgments go through 22. And then when you look in chapter 23, you see it's talking about the statutes. You can read about all of the statutes in Leviticus 23, but there are 3 or 4 that are mandatory. That's the Sabbath day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Tabernacles that we're talking about now, and Pentecost. You can see right there in verse 14, those are the statutes. But then when you go on in in this chapter, you see how verse 20 is talking about how he's going to send an angel to come keep us in the way. So we actually have help to actually keep the law and to actually help us through the tribulation. Well, look over here in Malachi chapter 4 and verse 4. This is the last chapter of the Old Testament, and he's reiterating that. You see in verse 4, he's saying, remember the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all of Israel. So when he's talking about the law, when you hear people talking about the law, they're talking about the book of the covenant. It starts in Exodus chapter 20, and it goes through and ends in Exodus chapter 24, verse 7. Let me show you that right quick. the law, the commandments, statutes, and judgments actually ended over there in 23. But this is kind of the end of the whole story over here when you get down to verse 7, when he says, and he took the book of the covenant and read it in the audience of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said will we do, and be obedient. So that is actually the law that it's talking about. I stress that because, there's a lot of confusion, people, thinking that the law involves all of the rules, all 613 different rules that you find in the Old Testament. No, the law doesn't include sacrificial laws. The covenant doesn't include dietary laws. There's nothing in there that says you're supposed to hit a man in the head with a rock for doing this or doing that. Nothing about killing people at all in the book of the covenant. We're never instructed to actually, that's not part of the covenant that we're under. So that's why it's important for us to go over there and read that. But you're looking over here, like we was reading in Exodus chapter 23, how he's saying, to remember the commandments. We saw that, the statutes. We saw that, the judgments of the book of the covenant. And then you read in verse 5, it says, behold, I send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And then when you look over at chapter 3, it's telling you, making a connection between this Elijah the prophet and the covenant angel. So what it's talking about in Exodus chapter 23 is how we will get the indwelling of the Elijah spirit, this covenant angel. In other parts of the Bible, he's called Michael. A lot of places he's called the covenant angel, and a lot of places he's called Elijah. And you hear people talk about the Elijah spirit. This is who they're talking about. But it is necessary that we obey the covenant in order to ever hear from this angel. So that's why you see them over here in Nehemiah chapter 9 reading this book of the covenant, like they're reading it every day. They're reading it for a few hours every day, going forward. Even after the Feast of Tabernacles is over, it's like they're drilling in those rules. And I would believe that is actually necessary to keep this tabernacle intact. The cement ain't quite dried on this structure that we're building here, this spiritual structure, where you can imagine you don't want the rain to hit it and wash away some of that cement. It may weaken the foundation on this thing. So we have to be really careful until this thing hardens up, and then we don't have to worry about some of those arrows of the devil trying to get in and mess us up. All right. And another point that I'll make over there when it's talking in verse 2, when it's saying separated from Israel, this is what not Genesis, but the book of Revelation is talking about when he says to come out of her. You read about that over in the book of Revelations in chapter 18, where you have this mighty angel coming down. And it's saying there in verse 2, it says, and cry with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen. And then you see down there in verse 4 how we're saying, come out of her, talking about coming out of Babylon. See, in my last class, we told you how, or explained how we are a modern day Egypt, because we're still embracing the technologies and different things that was created over there in Egypt, like purchasing food and doctors and schools and prisons and all of that stuff was created in Egypt. And, since we still have that stuff going on today, we're kind of a modern Egyptian culture. Well, we are also a modern Babylonian culture, because it says in Babylon that all of the false religions was created. All of those pagan holidays that we talked about a few minutes ago, they were actually created in Babylon, where a false religion was, built around those. And we still keep, many of those holidays even today. You hear people sometimes say that Christianity is one of the most pagan religions there is because, it is the Christian religion that has incorporated the worship of those pagan gods into their religion. You don't see the Muslims religiously celebrating Easter or Christmas. Christianity is the only religion that religiously celebrates pagan holidays, opposed to the pagans. They celebrate them religiously too. But you see right here in verse 4, it says to come out of that religion, to separate us get us out of that religion, or we're going to be a partaker in her sins, and going to receive of her plagues. You also have Hanukkah coming up. That's a very big deal. Guys, we kind of missed those over the few years and not celebrated Hanukkah like we should be paying attention to it. I believe it's because, everybody thought it had something to do with lighting a candle, for 8 days or whatever, which, you find that over in the Talmud. But, when you look at what the Bible actually says about Hanukkah, it's, a much bigger deal. It's kind of like a second Tabernacles. It actually and I'm gonna do some classes on this as we learn going away, but it almost appears to be like a Pentecost type event. I mean, if you think about how you had unleavened bread, and at the end of unleavened bread you had the feast of first fruits, and then after the feast of first fruits you counted 50 days until you got to Shavuot or Pentecost, which was another mandatory feast. Well, after the Feast of Tabernacles, you have the 8th day, which is called Shemini Atzeret or something like that. But you count 57 days, and then you end up on the Feast of Hanukkah. So, those 7 days, I was trying to figure out where those extra 7 days come from. It either has something to do with what we were reading about over there in Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 1, because Solomon, he kept his feast going he kept a 14-day feast instead of a 7-day feast. So that may be where those extra 7 days are at. But I also saw let me show you this right quick. Over here in the book of Jubilees, and chapter 28 is talking about Reuben, Israel's firstborn, the firstborn child of Israel, or firstborn child of Jacob, was actually born on the 14th day of the 9th month. And, that could have something to do with those 7 days that we're those additional 7 days, because it is about 7 days later that you start the Feast of Hanukkah. But anyway, we'll get to working on those. Don't forget about the date of Purim. We'll be watching those dates coming up. And remember, guys, we're looking for spiritual events. Don't be like those guys that's really only looking for something, physical to happen. If you're waiting for a physical event, that's going to be at the last moment. You're going to miss a lot of spiritual stuff taking place. For instance, this tabernacle being built on our hearts. If you're waiting to see only the physical events, your tabernacle may not get much construction done, at all. So let's keep looking for the spiritual. The physical stuff will take place. It is that spiritual stuff that we can actually miss. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and close this out. If you got something out of this video, go ahead and hit the like button. If you didn't, hit the dislike button, but leave us a comment either way. And shalom. May the Lord bless thee and keep thee. May the Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace.